Well, welcome again, and we're excited to hear this is a second breakout session from Kunkle, and this topic is, if God is good, why is there evil and suffering? So let's welcome Brett again to the front.
All right, there, can you hear me? We're good. This is a difficult talk in one sense. The question of evil and suffering and pain is often prompted by something personal in our lives, right? I mean, the first time that you will really wrestle and grapple with this question is probably not going to be on a philosophical level. It's going to be on a personal level. And for most of us, as I look around the audience, and, we're not, middle schoolers or high schoolers, which means we've lived enough life experience where we've probably already had those personal encounters. I know that was the case for me when I really first wrestled with this question. I grew up in Southern California, and when I was in middle school, our family got involved with a really good church in Southern California. And in fact, it was the pastor's son who I had met at my middle school who invited us, and we were kind of looking for a church at the time. And so that is when I met the Vasquez family. And the Vasquez family, there you go. You can see that picture is straight out of the 80s, right? That was my pastor, Pastor Dan on the left-hand side, his wife, Bev, in the middle, and then Jenny and Jody, their daughters, and then my best friend throughout middle school and high school was Danny, or Dan Jr., and so Danny and I met when we were in junior high. Here's a picture of Danny and I in junior high, like really very cool-looking junior hires. Danny and I went to high school. We were in the same youth group together. We were best friends. In fact, Danny and I shared the same birthday. So we would do our birthdays together every year. We were both born on June 9th. And then we both went to college, the same place. Eventually after college, he ended up moving to Iowa. I stayed in Southern California. So, we kind of split up a little bit. But periodically, he would come back to Southern California and visit. And so the last time he was in Southern California, which was a number of years ago, I said, hey, let's take a picture together. And so here's a picture of me and Danny as adults. One of us stopped growing in middle school, and one kept growing. I'll let you guess which one it was. Danny is actually, he's like 6'4" or 6'5", and you can't see in that picture, but I'm trying to stand on my tippy toes to be as tall as possible. Okay. So anyway, that's Danny. Now, when I was, when we started going to Chino Valley Community Church, where his dad was the pastor, it was kind of cool for me because Danny was my best friend. I got to spend a lot of time kind of behind the scenes, if you will, with my pastor. I would go and spend the night at the Vasquez family. Danny, of course, he'd come spend the night at my house. We just were always at each other's house. And so I got to see that Pastor Dan was the same guy on the stage teaching as he was off the stage. He was a man of integrity. He was a godly man. He served our church very well. So that was a really unique perspective I got to have. Well, it was Danny and me, we were the same age, same grade. During our freshman year in high school, freshman year in college, right after we graduated from high school, Pastor Dan was diagnosed with melanoma cancer. And so he went on an aggressive kind of, treatment plan of chemotherapy and radiation. And really, for the next year, we watched our pastor and his family battle this cancer. And it was filled with its ups and downs and, hopeful prognosis and not so hopeful prognosis. And I remember towards the end of that year, things kind of took a turn for the worse. And the doctor said that they were not going to really be able to do any more medical treatment. It got to the point where there was really nothing else they could do. Cancer had spread throughout his body. In fact, I was at the Vasquez home the day that they moved in a hospital bed into his living room because he could no longer kind of get up the stairs without a whole lot of effort to his bedroom. And so they were just at this point working to figure out how to make just him more comfortable. So they brought a hospital bed into the living room and put it there. And a few weeks later, I was out with one of our pastors. I was an intern at the church at this point. And I was out with the associate pastor, and Pastor Dan's health was not good. And so we got a call that he had stopped breathing. And the paramedics had come over to the house, and they had resuscitated him, but they had taken him to the ICU. And so me and the associate pastor rushed over to the ICU, and of course, words quickly spread at our church, like, Pastor Dan's at the ICU, and come and pray. And so we were there at the hospital, and the hospital waiting room just started filling up with people from our church. In fact, it got so crowded that there were people in the hallways there, and people were praying. And I remember at the beginning of the whole thing, like when Pastor Dan was diagnosed, but he was still in decent health, right? People were praying, not only people in our church, but other churches. But I remember some of the folks in our church expressing this great confidence that God was going to heal Pastor Dan, right? And even kind of till the end, people were hoping and expressing that. So there was all kinds of prayer for Pastor Dan, but at this moment, he's in the ICU, he's unconscious, it's looking dire. Danny, of course, was there, and I remember that evening, because we got over to the hospital in the afternoon. That evening, Danny was hungry, and I was hungry, and so we walked down the street to a local fast food place, and we had a hamburger together. And it just was a surreal moment, sitting there with my best friend, and he was talking about possibly never seeing his father again. Just a surreal moment. Go back to the hospital, and there's nothing you can do. You're sitting there waiting. And later in the evening, I remember I was sitting outside of the ICU. I was sitting on the tile floor. It was this like white tile floor. Sitting outside of the ICU doors. There were these two double doors that went into the ICU unit. And then right around the corner, like the first room on the left, was Pastor Dan's room. And they had him, of course, hooked up to a heart monitor. And I was able to hear, from where I was sitting in the room, I was able to hear the beeping of the heart monitor, right? I could hear the beep, beep, beep. And I remember the moment when the heart monitor flatlined. And I remember hearing that sound right there. And at that point, the doctors had decided there was nothing else that they were going to do. And then, after I heard the flatline, just a moment later, I heard a sound that I had never heard before. And it was a sound of human wailing. Because Bev, Dan's wife, and Danny, and Jenny, and Jody were all in the room when he passed. And so they just, of course, were overcome with their grief, and they were wailing and crying. And it was just almost unbearable to hear, my best friend and his family, who I'd been so close to, just overcome with such grief. That is the moment for me that I really began to wrestle with this question. Right now, the problem of evil and pain and suffering was not just a philosophical question. I remember thinking, God, why allow this to happen? Pastor Dan wasn't one of the bad guys. Pastor Dan was one of the good guys. Here's a guy who gave his life for the ministry. He sacrificed so much for your work. Why? And I had to really wrestle with this. Of course, when you wrestle with it personally, it's a challenge. There's additional challenges. And so we need to figure out how to think carefully through this issue, because it's not just philosophical, it's also personal. And so C.S. Lewis is going to be a really good guide for us. I'm going to use C.S. Lewis as a guide on this topic, okay? Now, if you're familiar with C.S. Lewis and some of his writings, you'll see why he ends up being very helpful here. But Lewis says this. He says, I believe in Christianity as I believe that the sun has risen. Not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else. What is Lewis saying there? Well, think about the analogy, right? The sun. You can step outside each and every day, look up directly at the sun, and come to the conclusion that the sun is there, that the sun has risen. I'm guessing, though, that's not how most of us determine whether or not the sun is out, right? What's the other way that we know the sun is out? Well, what does he say? By it, you see everything else. You just go outside, and if the world is lit up around you, and you can see everything else out there, you know the sun's up, because it lights up the world around you. Do you see the analogy? Not only is there direct evidence for the Christian faith, but one of the other powerful evidences for the Christian faith is that the Christian faith makes sense. It lights up the world around us. It provides answers to our deepest questions. It's what philosophers call, philosophers say it has explanatory power. It can explain all the features of reality. And when it comes to this topic, I think that Lewis is right. In fact, Lewis is no stranger to the topic of pain. In 1940, Lewis wrote a book entitled The Problem of Pain, right? And it's really his treatment of the topic philosophically. And he's trying to demonstrate that God's existence is compatible with the existence of pain and evil and suffering. And I think it's a fantastic book. It's not a very long book. It's a book you should read. It's a really good treatment of the topic. All right, and we're actually going to cite it a little bit. But if you know anything about Lewis's life, you know that he came to marriage later on in life. About 20 years later, after he wrote Problem of Pain, he met this woman, Joy Davidman. And they were married, but their marriage was short-lived. It was about 3 years of marriage before she died of cancer. Now, Lewis and Joy knew that she had this diagnosis before they got married, but she passes away a few years later. And after her passing, Lewis writes a different book on the same topic. The book is entitled A Grief Observed. And that book that he wrote in 1940 dealt with the philosophical piece of this. The book he wrote, I believe it was in 1963 after Joy died. This one, A Grief Observed, is really about the personal journey. In fact, it's like you're following him kind of journaling through this experience. And it's at some points, especially in the beginning, it's pretty raw. He's pretty honest with God. In fact, here, listen to this description that he gives about God. He says, but go to him, go to God when your need is desperate, when all other help is vain, and what do you find? A door slammed in your face, and a sound of bolting and double bolting on the inside. After that, silence. And he's, what a description, an honest description of what he was experiencing, right? Saying, God, where are you? You're silent in the midst of my pain. And you see him working through this, and he continues to journal through it, and eventually comes to a point where he makes peace with God at the end. But, very interesting, these two books covering the same topic, but are two very different books. And they actually help us to distinguish between two different problems when it comes to pain and evil. Okay? The first one is what we might call the emotional problem of evil. The emotional, or sometimes we'll refer to it as the existential problem of evil. And this is just the experience of evil and suffering itself, right? And we need to understand that when we or our friends or our family or someone we care about is in the middle of pain and suffering and hurt, we need to be sensitive to that and realize that that may not be the time, right, for all of our answers to kind of make sense of everything. Think about Job, the book of Job. In Job chapter 1, what happens? Job experiences tremendous calamity in his life, horrible things, right? Loses kind of everything. And then in Job chapter 2, his friends come to him. And what do Job's friends do when they first come to him and see him? Well, in Job chapter 2, we see this description. Now, when Job's three friends heard of all this adversity that had come upon him, they came each one from his own place, and they made an appointment together to come to sympathize with him and comfort him. When they lifted up their eyes at a distance and did not recognize him, they raised their voices and wept. And each of them tore his robe, and they threw dust over their heads toward the sky. Then they sat down on the ground with him for 7 days and 7 nights, with no one speaking a word to him, for they saw that his pain was very great. Those are some good friends, right? I mean, imagine being in so much pain, but you had the kind of friends who would just come and weep with you and sit with you, even in silence for a week. I want those friends, right? I want to be that kind of friend. But it helps us to see in the midst of pain and suffering and hurt that maybe the first step is just to really be gentle and to love our friends. And maybe that's just the time where we sit in silence with them. We stop talking, we listen, we hug them, we weep with them. And that is what is needed when someone is in the midst of pain and suffering, right? When they're dealing with the emotional problem of evil. That is what they need from us. And so we need to be able to remember that and to be patient and walk slowly with people who are suffering, okay? And there will be a time to point them to the Scriptures. And maybe in the midst of that, there will be times where you open up the Scriptures or you share, verses or whatever, but being sensitive to the fact that they're struggling emotionally with it, right? And sometimes they just need us to be with them. Does that make sense? Okay, so it's an important distinction to make because the problem of pain is personal. So you have the emotional problem of evil, but of course, then you distinguish that from the intellectual problem of evil. And with the intellectual problem, you're going to have to solve that one differently. We're going to need to provide intellectual answers. And that's what Lewis did in his book, The Problem of Pain, right, in 1940. Now, the intellectual problem of evil can be expressed this way. This is Sam Harris. He's a prominent atheist in the U.S. I don't if you he's probably one of the top 3 atheists in the U.S. Maybe you've heard of him. Here's how he sums up the problem. He says, either God can do nothing to stop catastrophes, or he doesn't care to, or he doesn't exist. God is either impotent, evil, or imaginary. Take your pick and choose wisely. So there you go. There's the dilemma presented to us by the skeptic. God, how do you believers reconcile a good, loving, powerful God with the existence of evil and suffering in the world, right? You feel the tension. Okay. So now what we want to do for the rest of our time is deal with the intellectual problem, okay? Now, just so you know, if anyone's a little more philosophically inclined, even within the intellectual problem, you could make a distinction between what's called the logical problem and the evidential problem, okay? Now, for those of you who are not philosophically inclined, forget I said that, all right? Doesn't matter a huge deal. Just know that Christian philosophers have dealt with the logical problem. In the philosophical world, most of the action is on what's called the evidential problem, okay? And so the logical problem says, hey, God's existence is incompatible. It's logically incompatible with evil. You can't have them both. Christian philosophers, through what's called the free will defense, have shown that they are compatible. And so the action is shifted. And so the action is shifted, and I want to illustrate this for you. It's not that they're logically incompatible. It's not that evil and God are logically incompatible. It's just that the evidence of evil outweighs God. So think of scales, all right? You have two sides of the scale, the evidence against God and the evidence for God. So here's what the skeptic is doing. He's saying, look, on this one side of the scale, the evidence against God, we can put evil, and we can put this instance of evil and this instance of evil, and what happens? The scales tip against God, all right? And so the skeptic says, look, all this evil in the world, this is an argument that there's no God. Doesn't mean it's logically impossible, but given the evidence, there's probably no God out there. Make sense? Okay, here's what we want to do. We want to say, look, can we offer explanations where maybe we remove that as evidence against God, and actually do we have anything to say in response that can put evidence on this side for God's existence? Okay, so that's what we're going to try and do. Okay, so first thing that we have to do, though, when it comes to many of these challenges, is we have to define our terms. So what's the key term that we need to define here? The key term that we need to define is evil. All right, why? Well, sometimes the challenge is going to be stated this way. Does evil exist? Of course evil exists. Okay. Who brought everything into existence? Well, according to you Christians, it was God. If God brings everything into existence and evil exists, doesn't that mean God is the creator of evil then, right? Now, how many of us would want to hold the view that God is the author of evil? Does anyone want to hold that view? Probably not, because if you hold that view, which there are some theological views that would be where you'd have to go, but a lot of us want to resist that, because if God is the author of evil, in our minds, and I think rightly so, that calls into question his good character. Right? How is it compatible that God is the cause of evil and is at the same time a good and holy God, right? Now, what's the way out of this? Well, the way out of this is to define evil properly. Okay, so what we need to do is ask, in response to this, what is evil? What is evil? What do you mean by evil? Now, most people that you ask to define evil are going to give you examples. So if I said, hey, what's evil? They're going to say, well, murder, or child exploitation, or slavery, or some kind of example. And we may agree those are examples of evil, but giving us an example of evil is not the same thing as giving us a definition of evil. In fact, think about it. If you point to something as an example of evil, that assumes a definition. You have to have a definition first to be able to apply it in that situation. Does that make sense? Okay, so we need actually a definition, not just examples. So let me give you some illustrations that will help us to define what we mean when we say evil. All right, so think about a donut hole. You guys have donut holes in Canada? Okay, yeah? Yeah, all right. So donut hole looks like something like this. Is that what you're thinking? What? Timbits? Timbits. Is that where the name comes from? So Tim Hortons, so Timbits? Ah, okay. Do you ever refer to them as donut holes? Okay, I'm speaking that Americanese stuff. Okay, so Timbits. Okay, I love learning Canadian. Well, the first time I ever spoke in Canada, and it was cold, and I was wearing a beanie. And I referred to it as a beanie, and these Canadians are looking at me like, what? You mean you mean a toque? And I was like, a what? Anyway, okay. So I learned to do it. Okay, so Timbits. I'm going to have to change this slide for you Canadians. All right, so what is a Timbit? You would say this. Well, see, now now my analogy is not going to work. You can handle it? Okay, all right. So I'm going to say donut hole, but you say Timbits. You're going to think it's this. Well, in the U.S., we call this a donut hole, and I would say we have completely mislabeled this thing. This is not a donut hole, folks, right? It may be a Timbit, but it's not a donut hole. What's a donut hole? Let me define for you a donut hole, okay? A donut hole, logically speaking, is the place of the donut where there is no donut. All right? That's a donut hole right there. Now, what do you call that? Okay, that's a donut hole? So you have it right. Timbits, and look, Canadians solve this philosophical problem. Good for you. All right. Visit more often. A donut hole, no, notice, think about this. We use a term, donut hole, to refer to something that's not really there, right? We do this in other things, with other things as well. Okay, how about a shadow, right? You call shadows, right? Okay, all right. Sorry, I like to make fun of you. What is a shadow? Is a shadow a tangible thing? Is it a tangible thing? Someone pick up your shadow and show it to us right now. Yeah, you can't do that, right? Because a shadow is not something. What is a shadow? A shadow is the absence of something. It's the absence of light in a particular place. That's what we mean when we say shadow. So when we say shadow, what are we referring to? We're referring to the absence of something. Or think about blindness. What is blindness? Blindness is just the absence of sight, isn't it? It's not a thing in and of itself. It's the absence of something that should be there. Okay, so I want you to give you these three examples to show you that we sometimes refer to things that are not tangible. They're not something in and of themselves, but they're actually the absence of something. That helps us to make sense of evil. What is evil? Well, look, let's say this knife was used to cut somebody open. Would you say the knife was evil? Or what if it was used by a thief and he stabs a man or a woman and takes their purse or wallet? Does the knife become evil then? We probably don't want to say the knife is evil, right? There's something where we're like, I don't think the knife is evil. It's not the knife is evil. In fact, the same blade could be used by a doctor to cut out a cancerous tumor, and that would be a good situation. So it's not the blade itself that's evil. Instead, we say there's some improper relationship. There's something missing in the relationship between the blade and the body. There's a broken relationship. What's the relationship? Well, in one situation, you have an absence of goodness, right? In the other one, goodness is present. And so I think that gets us to a definition of evil as philosophers would say, as a privation or as an absence of something. Evil can be simply defined as the absence of good. Evil is the absence of good. Okay? It's not, so evil is not stuff. It's not stuff that was made. Evil is a lack of good, right? And so think about it this way. Evil is parasitic. It's like a parasite. You have to have good for there to be evil. You don't have to have evil to have good, because good is the standard, but evil is like a parasite on it. Evil is the absence of good, okay? And so it's not stuff. You're not going to walk outside today and trip over some evil, all right? It's not that kind of thing. You can't go down to the deli and say, hey, I'd like to order 2 pounds of evil, right? Evil is not stuff. Evil is the absence of something. It's the absence of goodness. Evil is a corruption of what is good. Okay, so that helps us to answer this question. Did God create evil? No. The answer is no. God did not create evil. Even though God is the creator of all things, he did not create evil. Instead, what he created was good. At the end of each creation day, right? It is good. It is good. It is good. He creates a good world. Evil is the result of morally free agents. This is the free will defense. Evil comes as a result of genuine human freedom that chooses to bring evil into existence or chooses against God's goodness. All right. This is, of course, in the scriptures, the fall of man, the fall of Adam and Eve. Moral agents who, in their own genuine freedom, choose to rebel against their creator and bring evil into existence. So who is responsible for bringing evil into the world? Not God, but mankind. Okay? And that's a basic sketch of the free will defense. Evil is the result of human free choice. Here's how Lewis talks about it, right? Because he anticipates an objection to this. He says, God created things which had free will. That means creatures which can go wrong or right. Some people think they can imagine a creature which was free, but had no possibility of going wrong. But I can't. If a thing is free to be good, it is also free to be bad. Now, just pause for a moment. Do you understand what he's saying there? Because some people will say, well, why didn't God just create us with freedom, but just make sure that we always did what was right? But that's a logical contradiction, isn't it? You're not genuinely free if God is making sure that you only do what is right. That's not genuine freedom. All right? Now, he then anticipates a follow-up question. Okay, why would God allow this if he knew, right, that we would rebel? He says, and free will is what has made evil possible. Why then did God give them free will? Because free will, though it makes evil possible, is also the only thing that makes possible any love or goodness or joy worth having. So there's some greater goods that are available to us because we are genuinely free. Think about it. It seems like moral goodness requires genuine freedom, doesn't it? So for instance, let's say we had some charity that helped those who were less fortunate or those who were poor or those who had just suffered a tragedy. And we said, you know what, we're going to pass around a bag right now or a plate. I want everyone to donate, and let's do this good work of donating to this cause. But as I pass around the bag, I also have in my hand a gun, and I point it to your head and say, okay, I want you to give as much as possible, right? And you feel compelled to give everything that you have right now because you're under the threat of a gun. Do we then, afterward, let's say we collected $15,000, $20,000 from this group here right now, would afterwards we reflect on that and say, wow, what an amazing act of moral goodness that you guys all gave $20,000. Would we do that? No. Why? Because it was coerced. It was forced, right? And we know that when an action is forced, if I force you to do something, that seems to be contradictory with the action actually being good in and of itself. Or love seems to have this requirement, right? If I ask my wife, when we were kind of dating, said, I'm in love with you, honey. I want you to marry me. And she said, I don't think we're ready. And I pulled out a gun and said, yes, you're ready, right? You're going to walk down the aisle right now, And I forced her into some kind of marriage. Would we say, oh, gosh, what a beautiful picture of love, right? No, because we understand that love and goodness seem to require there being some concept of freedom or some idea that this was not coerced, right? And so that's what Lewis is saying. Why did God give them freedom? Because some of the most amazing and best things in life come with genuine freedom, okay? So what do we have? That's just a quick sketch of what's called the free will defense. And a lot of Christians are familiar with that. I think we probably need to articulate it better, but it's the idea that God is not responsible for moral evil. It's humanity, our own free choices, to bring evil into existence. All right, so that's called the free will defense. Now, there is a lot more we can say, but that's one thing that we can put on this side of the scale. What else can we put on this side of the scale? Well, some might say this. The skeptic might say, okay, let's say they buy the free will defense. God has given us freedom, and but he still knew this, right? He still knew what would happen, and he still permitted it. So why would God do that? Well, here's our second response. We might say God has morally sufficient reasons for allowing evil. Okay, now let me unpack this one a little bit, okay, to really understand this. God may have morally sufficient reasons for allowing or permitting the evil he has permitted. Because we would say God isn't the cause of evil, but if you hold to some view that God is sovereign, then you have to say he allowed it in some sense, right? So we're still on the hook there. Why would God allow it? Why would he permit it? Okay, this is where we need to consider something. We need to consider our finitude. You know what I mean by finitude? That we are finite creatures. We are finite and we are limited in our ability to know things. All right, and this was illustrated very well to me in a movie that I watched a number of years ago. It was one of Gwyneth Paltrow's first movies. It was called Sliding Doors. Has anybody in here seen this movie, Sliding Doors? No? Okay. It's probably 20 years old. I want to show you the first minute and a half of this. It's going to set the movie up, and I'll explain to you what happens. But when I saw this movie, it made me understand this whole idea that we are finite in our understanding. So watch this opening scene. Okay, you kind of catch what's going on there? Right, so they have this scene, Gwyneth Paltrow is trying to make the subway train. The first scene, the little girl gets in her way, she has to go around her, she loses that split second, gets to the subway train, misses it. They rewind it, the parent moves the child so she gets that split second back, she gets to the door, she's able to open it and get in. And at this point, the movie breaks into kind of two separate movies. And they parallel each other. And one movie follows her life and what happens if she makes the subway train. The other movie, basically that's running parallel, follows her life and what happens if she misses the subway train. Okay? So it's fascinating. And what you end up, and look, would you think that missing a subway train is a life-altering event? Would you think? No, but it could be. You just can't know, can you? Until you watch the movie. And in the movie, two different lives emerge. One is filled with happiness and joy and seems so wonderful, and the other one, because of that one event, is filled with kind of tragedy and sorrow. And then at the end, there's a huge twist. I won't give it away, but here, I remember watching that movie, and it was kind of one of those mind-blown moments. And I remember sitting there thinking, I never would have guessed this. I never could have seen this coming, right? Why? Because I'm a finite human being. And it made me think about my finitude, my inability to know very much about the future, or know how one event will cause something else, or to know how my actions will impact others. I really have no clue, and neither do you, right? So what does that mean? That means we are in no position to judge whether or not God actually has good reasons for what he allows. Does that make sense? We could never say, the skeptic could never say, God does not have good reasons for what he allows. You couldn't say that. You would have to have all the knowledge. You would have to be omniscient to be able to say that, right? Here's another analogy that will just take this a little bit further. I have 5 kids, right here. My kids when they were younger, I got 2 boys, I have 3 girls. Right, and now, of course, they're older, so we're done with the baby stage and all of that. But there was a time when all of my kids were babies, and we would take them to the doctors for regular checkups, right? And so I remember my boys. For whatever reason, the Kunkle boys they were fat, little, round, like fat balls, okay? Just all this skin. This is Micah, my oldest. Look at that beautiful pear shape, right? He grew up to be a plumber. No, I'm just kidding. There's Jonah. Here's Jonah. This is Jonah, a 4-month-old doctor appointment. All right, you see all that wonderful fat. He kind of looks like Buddha, doesn't he? He has the body of a god. So we had these fat little babies. I remember taking Micah in. Let's take Micah, for instance. I remember taking him at 4 months of age to the doctors. And we went to the doctors, and I remember going to the doctors, and the nurse takes us back to this back room, and my wife and I were there together, and the nurse says to me, she says, okay, Dad, because I was holding Micah, she says, Dad, I want you to take his clothes off, but leave his diaper on. So stripped him down to his diaper. Then she took him from me, and she weighs him, and she measures him, and she does these checks, and then she hands him back to me. She hands him back to me, and she says, okay, I want you to put him on the table. And there was a doctor's table there with a white crinkly paper, right? So I put him down on the table, and she's like, okay, I want you to hold his ankles. And so there's Micah laying, he can't move because he's too fat, right? So he's laying there. He's looking at me right into my eyes, and I'm holding his ankles like this, right? And so, of course, he sees Dad. He sees the familiar face. So he's smiling at me. He's like, and I'm like, oh, Micah, And then the nurse asked my wife, she's like, okay, will you get behind him? I want you to hold his arms down, right? And then that mean nurse wheels over this little metal table with 4 syringes, okay? And those syringes, the needles on those syringes were probably about that big. They were like that, right? And what does she do? She just grabs that and gives him a shot, grabs another and gives, what does he do? Well, the first shot, I mean, he had so much fat in his legs that it took him like 5 seconds to feel it. But, that needle sticking out, and all of a sudden I'm just looking at his face. I'm like, wait for it, here it comes. Right, he starts crying with the first shot, and then the second one, and then she gave him 2 more. So he had these 4 shots. Now, he's crying at the end of this, right? When you look at that kind of event, and you see something like that happening, and you see a parent who permits their child to experience pain, do you then conclude, oh, he's a bad parent, right? Now, pause here. We've got to talk about this, right? Okay, vaccinations. I don't care what your views about vaccinations are for the moment, okay? Think about a parent who's for whatever reason, they're wanting to do something to protect their child. When you look at that, even though it requires some pain, do you look at that parent and say that's a bad parent? Of course not. Right? You would say that, no, that is actually the action of a parent who's trying to do something good. And so, now, does the kid understand? No. I mean, even when the kids are older and they had to get some shot for something. I remember taking my daughter, Ella, she was 5 years old, and by that time, she's number 4. She's 5 years old. My wife's like, you're taking her to the doctor. I'm done, right? So I'm taking Ella to the doctor, and I know she's going to have to get shots. And I know it's not a good idea to wait till you're in the office and surprise her. Hey, surprise, you get a shot. So I'm trying to have a rational conversation with her on the way to the doctor. So I'm like, Ella, you're going to have to get a shot when we go there, right? What's her response as a 5-year-old? No, Dad, I don't want a shot. She starts crying. So what do I say to her in that situation? Well, I had to say to Ella, I said, look, Ella, I want you to know that your father has morally sufficient reasons to cause you pain right now. Right? Okay, did I use that language? No. But I was trying to give her that explanation. Hey, Ella, this is good for you, and this is what it's going to do, and da-da-da-da. And I'm trying to help her see that I have good reasons to permit some pain in her life. Now, after I gave her that explanation, what did she do? She wiped away the tears. She stopped crying. She said, okay, Dad, yeah, let's do this. Is that what my 5-year-old did? No, you know that because you've taken your 5-year-old, right? And she said, Dad, I don't care. I still don't want the shot. She couldn't understand the explanation. Now think about it. If there is a gap in understanding between a 5-year-old child and an adult parent, what's the gap in understanding and knowledge between a finite human being and an infinite God who knows all things? Do you see why it's not rational to be able to say God can't have a good reason for what he allows? Even if we don't know what the reason is, we still cannot argue that he doesn't have a good reason. He may have morally sufficient reasons. In fact, here's how C.S. Lewis describes it in a very witty way. He says, what do people mean when they say, I'm not afraid of God because I know he is good? Have they never even been to a dentist? Right? A dentist has morally sufficient reasons to allow pain in your life. And so what do we have? We have another explanation for why God might allow evil. And we put that on that side of the scale. Now, look, there's more to say. Turns out, evil is evidence for God's existence. Evil is actually evidence for God's existence. Okay, let me illustrate this because I think this is one of the best responses to evil. Okay, how many of you have played organized sports before? Anyone played organized sports? All right, what's a big organized sport up here in Canada? Hockey, right? How many of you played hockey? Do a lot of you play hockey? Okay. Any other organized sports? Baseball? Soccer? Many soccer players? Yeah, I grew up playing soccer. I love soccer, so let's just take soccer, all right? In fact, I played soccer into my adult years. I loved it. And we used to play on Monday nights. Every Monday night in Southern California, I would suit up and I'd get a bunch of young guys, and I was real competitive, so try to keep up with them for as long as I could until my body started breaking down. Let's imagine I show up for my soccer game one Monday night. I missed the so what the referee would do is he would bring all the teams together. At the center circle, he'd give some explanation, then he'd blow his whistle, the game would start. So let's say I show up late or like 2 minutes before the game. I'm just trying to throw my clothes on. I'm missing the center instructions at the center circle. I jump onto the field just as the ref blows his whistle. My teammate passes me the ball. I start dribbling, and someone from the opposite team comes and they slide tackle me, but they don't touch the ball. Instead, their cleats just go right into my legs and go right into my calf, and I go down hard, okay? When I get up, who am I looking for? Yeah, some of you who are sinners say, that guy, right? No. Oh, let me clarify. Let's say I didn't hear a whistle. I go down hard, and I didn't hear a whistle. Who am I looking for? I might be looking for that guy. I'm also going to be looking for the ref, right? And I'm going to make an appeal to the ref. I'm going to say, ref, why didn't you blow your whistle? Why didn't you call a foul? Now, imagine the ref looks at me, and he says, oh, you were the player who missed the opening instructions. Oh, okay. Hey, both teams agreed that tonight's game of soccer was going to be played with no rules. Everyone can make the rules up for themselves. Now think about it for a second. In a soccer game where there are no rules, what happens to my appeal for a foul? It becomes irrelevant, right? Because in a game with no rules, guess what? There are no fouls. Now just take that analogy and apply it to the universe. In a universe with no rules, guess what? There are no fouls. In a universe with no moral goodness, no objective standard of goodness, guess what? There's no evil. But that is actually the atheist's biggest objection to God, right? Here's Richard Dawkins, author of The God Delusion. He says this is maybe his famous line, the most famous line in his book, The God Delusion. He says, the God of the Old Testament is arguably the most unpleasant character in all fiction. Jealous and proud of it, a petty, unjust, unforgiving control freak, a vindictive, bloodthirsty ethnic cleanser, a misogynistic, homophobic, racist, infanticidal, genocidal, filicidal, pestilential, megalomaniacal, sadomasochistic, capriciously malevolent bully. Right? I just want to say, Richard, how do you really feel? Like, don't hold back, man. So let's summarize what Richard Dawkins just said here. What did he say? That God is evil. That's the summary. God is evil. Now think about it. What does evil require? In order to say something is evil, you must have some standard of what? Goodness. To say something's morally evil, you have to have a standard of moral goodness by which to judge moral evil. In a game with no rules, there are no fouls. Right? Now, but Richard Dawkins is an evolutionist. He believes in cosmic and biological evolution. In fact, in an earlier book, his book, River Out of Eden, this is what he says. Now, think about, are these two statements compatible? God is evil, and in a universe of electrons and selfish genes, blind physical forces, and genetic replication, some people are going to get hurt, other people are going to get lucky, and you won't find any rhyme or reason in it, nor any justice. The universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, and no good. Nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. Do you see the problem? His evolutionary views undercut his primary objection to God. In his evolutionary view of the universe, there is no purpose, no design, no good, no evil. It's just blind, pitiless indifference. So what do we make then of his argument that God is evil? It makes no sense in his worldview. You can't have evil without some standard of goodness. In fact, C.S. Lewis, who was a former atheist, understood this. This is what Lewis says. He says, my argument against God was that the universe seemed to be cruel and unjust. But how had I got this idea of just and unjust? A man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line. What was I comparing this universe with when I called it unjust? And what do? We now have an argument for God's existence. Evidence is evil is evidence for God's existence because evidence requires an objective standard of goodness, but an objective standard of goodness or an objective moral law is best explained by a moral law giver. Laws are only given by lawgivers. An objective moral standard points us to the source of that, which would be God. All right? And so we'd put that on the side of the scale. Now, there's more we could say. There's what's called the soul-making defense. That's where we would say that God is interested in not just our happiness, but he's interested in our character. And so that's why he does in this life let us go through trials. This would be an appeal to something like James chapter 1, right? Consider it all joy when you encounter various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces endurance. And so we would put that on the side of the scale. In addition, we could talk about the perspective of eternity. Eternity seems to minimize some of the harms and the evils when we have an eternal perspective on those things. And then, in addition to that, we could also add the different arguments we have for God's existence. So the cosmological argument, the moral argument, the design argument, the argument from contingency, and on and on and on. And what would we do? We would start piling this stuff on this side of the scales. And what do we see? We see that we have very good reasons to think that God's existence as a good and loving and powerful creator is compatible with evil and suffering. Are you with me? Okay. Now, let me say one last thing. All right? So I think we can powerfully answer this problem of pain and evil and suffering. But here's the thing you need to understand. Christians are not the only one on the hook for answering this question. Every worldview and every religion has to explain evil and suffering. Okay? Guess what? Even the atheist has to give us an explanation for evil and suffering. In fact, there's a famous atheist, Bertrand Russell. He was a British atheist philosopher, and he had this famous line where he said, "No one can believe in a good God if they've sat at the bedside of a dying child," right? Kind of tugs on your heartstrings there. Well, this question also can be posed to the atheist. In fact, I have an atheist friend. He lives up in the Bay Area, in San Francisco area. His name's Ricardo, who I remember asking him this question. I thought, this would be an interesting strategy. Let me take this atheist question and pose it to my atheist friend. I said, Ricardo, I said, what would you say at the bedside of a dying child as an atheist? Like, how would you explain that? And I said, and it has to be consistent with atheism. What would be an atheist view of a child suffering, and you're sitting at their bedside and they're dying? What would you say to them to explain this? And I remember Ricardo, he's a thoughtful guy, but he sat there and he thought about it a little bit, and he said, well, he said, I guess I would say crap happens. Except he didn't say crap. Crap happens. I turned to Ricardo. I said, Ricardo, thank you. I said, that's an honest answer. That's about the only answer that seems to me to be consistent with atheism. Crap happens, and then you die. Okay, that's your atheist worldview. That's what's consistent. You die, you pop out of existence. There's no redeeming this. There's no hope in any of this. You suffer, you got dealt a bad hand, too bad. According to Richard Dawkins, it's nothing but what? Blind, pitiless indifference. The universe doesn't care, right? And I compare that with the Christian worldview, and the Christian worldview says, no, we have actually the solution to evil suffering. What is the solution to evil and suffering? It's God himself. Through the work of Christ on the cross. Because see, evil is not just out there. That's how we think about evil a lot, isn't it? Evil is not just out there. We know in the Christian worldview, evil is right in here. It's in every human heart, yours and mine. And that is where most of the evil comes from. What's the solution to that? God becoming man, suffering for our crimes, right? Jesus is the solution to evil. And not only his death, but guess what? His resurrection. What do we have in 1 Corinthians chapter 15? We have the final solution. And I think back to Pastor Dan, right? And walking with the Vasquez family through the loss of our pastor and our church wrestling with this. And our church ultimately, right, turned back to the scriptures. And what do we find in the scriptures? We found the hope of the resurrection. We knew that Pastor Dan's death by cancer was not the end of the story. I'll read this to close. 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 50 through 57. Now I say this, brethren, that flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God, nor does the perishable inherit the imperishable. Behold, I tell you a mystery. We will not all sleep, but we will all be changed. In a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, at the last trumpet. For the trumpet will sound, and the dead will be raised imperishable, and we will be changed. But when this perishable will have put on the imperishable, and this mortal will have put on immortality. Pause. What is Paul talking about? He's talking about our resurrected bodies. This body is not the end of the story. This body will die at one point, but then eventually we'll put on a resurrected body. Then will come about the saying that is written, death is swallowed up in victory. Oh, death, where is your victory? Oh, death, where is your sting? The sting of death is sin, and the power of sin is the law, but thanks be to God who gives us the victory through our Lord Jesus Christ. See, it's only the Christian worldview that not only explains evil, but then gives a solution to evil and provides us with hope that even in the darkest of days or the darkest of moments, that's not the end of the story. Isn't that beautiful? The Christian answer is not only true and good, it's beautiful. Amen? Let's pray. God, help us to put our hope in the resurrected Jesus. Help us to see how you have overcome evil. Give us the confidence to take the truth of Jesus to a world that needs this solution. We pray this in his name. Amen.